For more than 3 decades, Johnny Carson sat behind a desk and became a ritual in American homes. Night after night, he made millions laugh, relax, and believe that everything was going to be okay before turning off the lights. He was trusted, admired, and rarely questioned. But while America thought it knew Johnny Carson, the man behind that desk was living a far darker, colder, and more complicated reality. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the show that defined late-night television and the secrets its host never wanted anyone to see. The king of late night and the mask he never removed. Johnny Carson did not simply host a television show. He reshaped American culture. When he officially took over The Tonight Show in October of 1962, the country was changing rapidly. Television had become the central gathering place for American families, and late night was still an experiment rather than a guarantee. Carson turned it into a habit. Within a few years, millions of viewers planned their evenings around his opening monologue, his desk-side conversations, and the quiet assurance that nothing too extreme, political, or uncomfortable would ever cross the screen. Carson's success was overwhelming and sustained. Over the course of his reign, The Tonight Show dominated its time slot in a way no late-night program ever has since. He won 6 Primetime Emmy Awards, received the Television Academy's Governor's Award, and later earned a Peabody Award for excellence in broadcasting. He was inducted into the Television Hall of Fame while still on the air, and after retiring, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, followed by recognition from the Kennedy Center. By every public metric, Johnny Carson had achieved the highest form of American fame: universal acceptance. What made Carson unique was not just his wit, but his restraint. He was never vulgar. He avoided overt political alignment. During a period marked by civil rights turmoil, the Vietnam War, assassinations, and cultural upheaval, Carson stayed safely neutral. He knew exactly how far he could go without alienating Middle America. That discipline wasn't accidental, it was survival. The Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment. It was a business engine tied to sponsors, affiliates, and a massive national audience. Carson protected that engine relentlessly. Yet this control came at a cost. The man who appeared so relaxed on camera was anything but at ease in real life. Fellow host Dick Cavett later admitted that Johnny Carson was one of the most socially uncomfortable people he had ever known. Carson struggled with eye contact, disliked casual conversation, and avoided emotional openness. He carried a deck of cards everywhere he went, performing magic tricks not as a hobby, but as a defense mechanism. When anxiety took over, he performed. It was the only way he knew how to exist around people. This contradiction defined Carson's entire life. On television, he made intimacy look effortless. Off camera, he avoided it whenever possible. Guests often assumed Carson was their friend because of how warm he appeared on air, but that warmth almost never extended beyond the broadcast. He rarely socialized with guests before or after the show. Relationships were transactional. Once the cameras stopped rolling, the charm disappeared. The Tonight Show itself reflected this duality. Its structure, monologue, desk bits, guest interviews, and a musical or comedy closer became the blueprint for every late-night program that followed. Hosts from David Letterman to Jay Leno to modern figures all borrowed from Carson's formula. But behind the scenes, the atmosphere could be tense, cold, and unpredictable. Carson demanded control. He held grudges. And when he felt crossed, forgiveness was rarely an option. Rarely power, control, and the man who ran the show from the shadows. By the early 70s, The Tonight Show was no longer just a television program. It was an institution. And behind Johnny Carson's calm delivery and polished timing stood a production machine designed to protect him, serve him, and never challenge him. At the center of that machine was Fred de Cordova, the producer who helped Carson consolidate power and shape the show into the dominant force of late-night television. DeCordova joined the show in a senior role before being promoted to executive producer. On paper, his job was simple: keep the show running smoothly, manage talent, and ensure that Carson had everything he needed to perform. In reality, his role was far more delicate. Johnny Carson was notoriously sensitive to pressure, deeply resistant to interference, and highly intolerant of anything that threatened his control. DeCordova learned quickly that success meant anticipating Carson's moods before they surfaced. For years, the partnership worked. DeCordova shielded Carson from unnecessary conflict, handled network expectations, and quietly enforced Carson's preferences. Guests who irritated Johnny often found themselves uninvited. Staff members who crossed invisible lines learned that Carson never forgot a slight. The Tonight Show ran like a monarchy, and Carson ruled it absolutely. But cracks began to form when personal tragedy collided with professional routine. In the early 90s, Carson experienced the most devastating loss of his life: the death of his son Richard in a car accident along the California coast. When Carson returned to the show, he chose to address the loss on air. It was one of the rare moments when audiences saw him stripped of humor and control, speaking openly about grief. The segment ran long, too long for network standards. As Carson continued speaking, DeCordova signaled that time was running out. The show needed to wrap. From a producer's standpoint, it was a technical necessity. From Carson's perspective, it was unforgivable. In that moment, Johnny interpreted the signal not as professionalism, but as cruelty. The fallout was immediate and permanent. Carson banned DeCordova from the set for the remainder of the show's run. Though DeCordova retained his title until Carson's retirement, the relationship was over. There were no reconciliations, no private apologies, no acknowledgement of years of loyalty. For Johnny Carson, betrayal, even perceived, was final. Friends on camera, strangers off screen. To viewers, Johnny Carson seemed effortlessly warm. Night after night, he laughed with guests and created the illusion of genuine friendship. But once the cameras stopped, that warmth faded. Very few people ever moved beyond being professional acquaintances, and many guests later admitted they barely knew him at all. Carson treated The Tonight Show strictly as business. Guests were performers passing through, not friends. He rarely socialized before taping and almost never after. The connection ended the moment the interview did. This distance wasn't arrogance, it was self-protection. Conversation was his job, not his comfort, and after hours of performing intimacy, he withdrew completely. There was only one notable exception. When Orson Welles appeared in the mid-70s, Carson personally greeted him before the show, stunning the staff. He admired Welles deeply and treated him with quiet reverence rather than charm. For once, Carson dropped his emotional armor. That moment stood out because it was so rare. In decades of hosting, Carson formed almost no lasting bonds. Even Ed McMahon later said parts of Johnny were unreachable. Between commercial breaks, Carson could be cold and irritable, and staff learned to adapt to his silences. The show felt warm to the audience, but behind the scenes, emotional distance ruled everything. Alcohol, family, and the man he could not escape. For all the control Johnny Carson exercised over The Tonight Show, there was one force he never fully mastered: his private life. Away from the desk, away from the audience, Carson's world was marked by instability, alcohol, and relationships that slowly collapsed under the weight of his emotional distance. Johnny Carson married 4 times. 3 marriages ended in divorce. The 4th lasted only because death intervened. Each relationship followed a familiar pattern: intense charm at the beginning, followed by withdrawal, suspicion, and volatility. Carson was not a man who knew how to share space emotionally. He treated intimacy as something to manage, not nurture. Alcohol played a central role in this decline. In Hollywood circles, Carson's drinking was an open secret. He was known as a heavy drinker whose mood could shift without warning. The same man who delivered perfectly timed punchlines on camera could become unpredictable and cruel in private, especially after drinking. Colleagues learned to avoid him during breaks. Family members learned to brace themselves. In the early 80s, his drinking became impossible to ignore. Johnny Carson was arrested for driving under the influence after being pulled over in his DeLorean. The incident shocked the public. America's most composed television host was suddenly exposed as deeply unwell. He pleaded no contest and received probation, mandatory education, and strict driving restrictions. For a man who had spent decades controlling his image, it was a rare moment of public humiliation. Carson admitted in a televised interview that he had a problem with alcohol and that there were periods when he simply could not handle it. But awareness did not lead to lasting change. Drinking continued to fuel his worst impulses, especially within his family. The most painful example was his relationship with his children. Johnny Carson had 3 sons from his first marriage: Christopher, Richard, and Corey. Of the 3, Richard, known as Rick, suffered the most. Rick struggled with alcoholism and mental illness at a time when such conditions were poorly understood and deeply stigmatized. When Rick's condition deteriorated and he required hospitalization, Johnny Carson refused to visit him. This decision would define Carson as a father. Rick was isolated, frightened, and institutionalized. His father was one of the most powerful and wealthy men in America, yet he chose absence. Carson never showed up, not once. Friends later described it as emotional abandonment of the highest order. Johnny could face millions of viewers every night, but he could not face his own son in a hospital room. The tension between father and son erupted publicly years later at a high-profile industry event aboard the Queen Mary. Rick, already struggling, became intoxicated. Witnesses reported that Johnny confronted him aggressively. The exchange escalated into a screaming match in front of executives and media figures. At one point, Carson reportedly raised his fist as if to strike his own son before being stopped. The secrets he kept and the lies he helped maintain. By the final decades of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson was no longer just a host. He was a gatekeeper. Every night, Hollywood's most carefully constructed public figures sat across from him, smiling, joking, and presenting versions of themselves that millions accepted as truth. What viewers never realized was that Carson often knew exactly how artificial those versions were. Carson was not naive. He had spent decades inside the entertainment industry, watching careers rise and collapse, watching studios manage scandals, and watching lives be quietly rewritten for public consumption. As the most powerful interviewer in American television, he was entrusted with knowledge that could have destroyed reputations overnight. And he kept it. Rock Hudson is one of the most striking examples. When Hudson appeared on The Tonight Show, he embodied classic American masculinity: confident, handsome, effortlessly charming. What audiences didn't know, and what Carson did, was that Hudson was gay. In that era, such knowledge was not just private, it was dangerous. Hudson's career as a romantic leading man depended entirely on maintaining a heterosexual image. Studio executives, agents, and publicists constructed elaborate cover stories, including a brief marriage designed to silence rumors. Carson understood the pressure Hudson lived under. Interviews were conducted with extreme care. Questions were calibrated. Jokes avoided landmines. Both men knew what could not be said. Carson later described these moments as emotionally exhausting. He was not judgmental about sexuality, but he was deeply unsettled by the system that forced people to lie in order to survive. Cary Grant's case troubled him just as much. Grant's sophisticated image was built on elegance, romance, and a long list of marriages that reassured the public. But within Hollywood, Carson knew about Grant's long-term domestic partnership with Randolph Scott. For years, the two shared a home, a life, and a bond that studios reframed as bachelor companionship. Publicity photos showed them cooking, relaxing, and exercising together, images that now read clearly as intimate. but at the time were accepted without question. Carson reportedly found this fascinating and disturbing. The truth was visible, yet completely ignored because the industry provided a story people wanted to believe. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy represented another carefully managed narrative. To the public, they were the great, tragic love story of Hollywood. To Carson, the reality was more complex. He knew Hepburn's deepest relationships were not romanticized in the press. He observed how studios transformed ambiguity into mythology, smoothing contradictions until the public accepted fiction as fact. Then there was Raymond Burr. Perhaps no story disturbed Carson more. Burr presented himself as a widower, a war veteran, a man shaped by tragedy. None of it was true. His fabricated biography included marriages that never happened, a son who never existed, and military service he never performed. In reality, Burr lived for decades with his partner in a committed relationship that could not be acknowledged publicly. Carson once remarked that interviewing Burr felt like interviewing a character rather than a human being. The lie had become so complete that even casual conversation required performance. Carson recognized the psychological cost of sustaining such a fiction for a lifetime. These were not isolated cases. They were symptoms of a system. And Johnny Carson was part of it. In private conversations late in life, Carson expressed discomfort with how complicit he had been. He believed The Tonight Show helped maintain illusions that trapped people in lives they did not choose. He questioned whether entertainment had crossed into exploitation. But those reflections came too late to change anything. Johnny Carson made America laugh for 30 years, but the man behind the desk lived a life filled with silence, control, and secrets that never reached the screen. The Tonight Show felt warm and familiar, yet so much of its truth remained hidden until long after the cameras stopped rolling. Do you think Johnny Carson was a victim of the Hollywood system, or one of the men who benefited most from it? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you see late-night television differently, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more untold stories from behind the spotlight.